I'd like to welcome you all today. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 35-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas, Texas. I'd like to welcome you all to our Zoom virtual policy briefing today, co-sponsored with our friends at Right on Crime. And our topic today is the rise in violent crime around the country and what those of us who support criminal justice reform have to say about it. We appreciate you all being here with us. I want to especially thank those of you who are financial supporters of IPI and also financial supporters of Right on Crime. Thank you so much for your support. It makes possible the sort of things that we're doing today. And so we want to thank you very much for that. If you would like to know more about IPI, or if you'd like to chat about becoming a supporter of IPI, please feel free to contact Addie Crimmins at IPI, and she'll be happy to talk to you about becoming a member of our giving society. And of course, if you'd like to know more about Right on Crime, if you'd like to know more about supporting Right on Crime, you can go to their website as well. And it's very simple. It's rightoncrime.com. We will be taking questions from the audience today. If you want to ask a question, please don't use the chat function. Please use the Q&A function down at your bottom menu bar in your Zoom window. And we're noticing that we have a sort of a strange technical glitch today. A lot of folks are coming in, and for some reason, Zoom is identifying them as Zach McHugh. So I want to apologize to Zach McHugh for being cloned. It was not our intention to clone you, Zach. So I apologize for that. So if you have a question and Zoom is identifying you as Zach McHugh, please put your actual name sort of in parentheses at the beginning of your question, so we'll actually know who is asking the question. And we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. And like I mentioned earlier, our event will be recorded today, so you'll be able to go back and review it. You'll be able to share it with others. And so we will include both the presentations and the Q&A in that recording. Okay, so let's get on with our program. There's been growing recognition in the last decade or so that there was an abundance of opportunity to reform the criminal justice system in such a way that it would be more just, that it would be better calibrated so that punishment fit the crime. There were ways to create more opportunities for restitution and for redemption and rehabilitation. There were opportunities to prevent first-time and low-level violators from spending years in prison and becoming hardened criminals themselves. And frankly, there was an opportunity to save taxpayers a lot of money, because it turns out incarceration and prosecution can be very expensive. So Right on Crime was established as a conservative criminal justice reform effort. And in their own words, Right on Crime supports conservative solutions for reducing crime, restoring victims, reforming offenders, and lowering taxpayer costs. The movement was born in Texas in 2007 and has led the way to implementing conservative criminal justice reforms. And, we at IPI were among the early signatories to the Right on Crime effort, and we've been supporters of that effort. It's true that most of the activity on criminal justice reform has been happening in the states rather than at the federal level, but a major criminal justice reform success at the federal level, and one of the true signature successes of the Trump administration, was the First Step Act. In 2008. And that was a near thing. I remember being in Washington, D.C. the first week of December, not at all confident that it was going to happen, not at all confident that it was going to be a done deal. But it happened, and it has had a tremendous success at the federal level. As I said, we at IPI have been supporters of this effort, but not everybody on the center right has been. There were folks on the center right who were not at all enthusiastic about some of those criminal justice reform efforts. And now, as we look around the country and see an increase in crime, an increase in violent crime, some of the folks on the center right who have been opposed to criminal justice reform are now gleefully proclaiming that the fault of the rise in crime lies at the feet of the criminal justice reform effort. And so we thought that it would be a great idea to do a policy briefing on this topic, to talk about why criminal justice reform is important, what some of the successes have been, and then to answer those criticisms and to ask the question, is the right kind of criminal justice reform responsible for the increase in crime? Is there such a thing as the right kind of criminal justice reform and the wrong kind of criminal justice reform? And we have the best imaginable folks on our panel today to actually address those topics and answer those questions. We have Brett Tolman, who is Executive Director of Right on Crime, and we have Jerron Smith, who is a Senior Fellow with Right on Crime. So I want to first turn things over to Brett. Brett, I hope I have framed this accurately and fairly. And if not, please correct me, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts. And I would ask you to please start with the First Step Act and its significance and its accomplishments, why it was necessary. And then I'd like you to sort of move on and talk about this issue of the increase in violent crime and what those of us who are proponents of criminal justice reform have to say about it.
Sure, Tom, thank you very much. I thought you, phrased and captured the essence of the issue right now facing the country. And you have this interesting dynamic between, strong advocates on both the left and the right and politically that have been pushing for reforming the criminal justice system in this country. I come at this through first and foremost the lens of working in the criminal justice system for almost 25 years now. I spent over a decade as a prosecutor and very proud of a lot of the work that I did. The last case, President Bush put me in as U.S. attorney after I had been an assistant U.S. attorney for many years. And the last case I did as U.S. attorney was to prosecute the kidnapper of Elizabeth Smart. And, so I'm one in which my family has suffered at the hand of violence, and we've been victims of violent crime. And I also, I said about my purpose in life as a prosecutor was to prosecute violent crime and to try to make the streets safer and protect communities and to vindicate victims. And in some measure, I am very satisfied with my work in that area. However, I also got the opportunity to work on the other side of the aisle and work as a defense attorney and represent individuals. And I got to see the justice system from both sides. And I also got to see that there are things in the justice system that can be fixed, things that are broken, aspects of it that are not working. One of the more telling cases that I had was when I was 100% certain I had the right guy and indicted him. And turns out, Tom, I was wrong. And that was the first sort of inkling and understanding that prosecutors are not always right, and the justice system is not even close to being perfect. When you look closer and you lift up the curtain and you look at the criminal justice system, you see that while there are some things like my career that do work and that we can be proud of, there's many areas that are dysfunctional or they're failing. If you have a system, for example, that over 70 and approaching 80% recidivism of individuals who are getting out of prison are committing crime again, that's an 80% plus, failure rate of the criminal justice system in one way or another. So I came into the criminal justice reform movement, wanting to make a difference, but I also can say that the reason why I love Right on Crime and the reason why I'm the executive director today is because I believe that conservatives are the most important individuals and organizations in this movement. And the reason I say that is because if you don't involve conservatives in reforming the criminal justice system, you have a tendency then to try to change the criminal justice system based not on data and research, but on emotion. And you also forget that there really are violent criminals out there and that we do need to protect our communities, that there has to be safety. And you also can forget the victims of crime. And so that's why I implore conservatives to engage and to jump into it, and was thrilled with the opportunity to work on the First Step Act. I helped draft the predecessor bills to the First Step Act, the Corrections Act. And, very few people know that these were bills being led by Jason Chaffetz and Trey Gowdy in the House. And you had Senator Mike Lee and Orrin Hatch and Chuck Grassley. These are not shrinking violets. These are tough on crime individuals. But I think they recognized, and conservatives finally saw, that the criminal justice system needs accountability, needs transparency, and we need to fix what we can. And that's why the First Step Act, and Jerron will be able to give you a lot of insights on that. And we worked hand in hand, on that effort. It's modest in some ways because there are so many things that need to be changed, but it is successful, and it maintained that balance of remembering community safety and to incentivize individuals to lower their recidivism. And that's what the First Step Act did. And we'll get into more detail, but I'll let Jerron take it from here.
Here. Sorry about that. I had to unmute myself. Well, Tom, thank you so much for inviting me on. And Brett, thank you for the introduction. My name is Jerron Smith. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and I come to criminal justice reform having a lived experience. I didn't go to law school. I went to Washington just because I thought it would be a cool place to go to college. And after living there, I had this North Star to want to get involved in politics. And interesting enough, I became a Republican in DC. I grew up a Democrat. And in the community that I lived in, just like many of my colleagues, I had a single parent household. I was blessed to have being raised by my dad, which was different from most of my colleagues. My dad invested a lot in my education and ended up being the difference maker that allowed for me the opportunity to go to college. But many of the colleagues or friends that I grew up with fell into the criminal justice system. Many of them had parents who were on drugs and sold drugs. And I saw a lot of them who I've known since I was 5 or 6 years old end up in the justice system. And so it's always been a personal thing for me to do something to change communities and make communities stronger and safer. And so when I went to Washington and got a little taste of, I guess, the politics that happens here, I got an opportunity to work on the Hill. And about 15 years after that, I was hired by the Trump administration as the director for urban revitalization policy. And I quickly ascended to being a deputy assistant to the president for domestic policy. And that's where I met Brett Tolman. Prior to coming into the Trump administration, I spent some time doing advocacy work for Americans for Prosperity. And it was there that I learned about the Citizen Reform and Corrections Act, which was a combination of Brett's bill, the Correction Act, and some sentencing reforms that were added by Senator Dick Durbin. And, I was really championing this issue just because in my 20s, I even had the experience of being caught up in the justice system. And when I went into one suburb, I noticed that most of the individuals, even though it was a majority white suburb, everyone who was in the courtroom were people of color. And I was able to get some justice because I had enough resources to pay for a lawyer. But many of the individuals there could never afford counsel. And in many cases, weren't afforded the opportunity to get justice. And so this is something that motivated me to really want to do something about this issue. The communities, underserved communities around the country, of course, there are more than one thing that affects those communities, but having a safe community, getting caught up in the justice system just creates more barriers to opportunity. And so after getting involved at Americans for Prosperity and getting the opportunity to work on revitalization policy, I knew that justice reform to make a fairer justice system, safer justice system was extremely important. And I knew much about the Sentencing Reform and Correction Act. And the biggest thing I knew was that it wasn't something that conservatives could support. And so Brett came in and met with me, and we put our heads together, and he explained to me that originally the legislation known as the First Step Act was supposed to be focused on prison reform, and that if we were able to kind of reform our prisons in a way that allowed for low-level offenders to not recidivate and to live productive lives, we can then in time lower crime. And that's what happened in places like Texas and Georgia that had reformed their prison system in a way that encouraged more people to participate in recidivism reduction programming. And that's really the heart of the First Step Act, to reduce recidivism, to make safer communities and make citizens, 95 of which who go into the criminal justice system who are going to come home, make sure that they stay home and become productive citizens. Another part is focusing on those nonviolent offenders, to ensure that the resources that we put in from our justice system are focused on the most violent offenders for public safety. Of course, working for a president like President Trump, who is committed to being tough on crime, once we broached the idea or the topic of him working on criminal justice reform, he said that the one thing he needed to be able to get behind such reform was to have the support of law enforcement. And so I spent a good amount of time working with law enforcement, as well as some other senators who also shared that value of making sure we had law enforcement and that we were protecting people from violent offenders. And so senators like Ted Cruz and senators like Senator David Perdue weighed in to this conversation and helped us right size the First Step Back in a way that was going to put extra assurances around violent offenders and making sure that nonviolent offenders were the ones that would first be able to get a second chance. And, hindsight's 2020, but we were right. We were able to kind of pass a legislation that did something magical, and that was lower recidivism rates. Right now, I believe the recidivism rates around First Step Act individuals is in the teens, or like 12%. I think DOJ is due to kind of give a new update on what those recidivism numbers look like. But all the things that we're seeing is showing that it worked, because the federal recidivism numbers are around 30%. And so imagine all the lives and all the victims that are not being affected because we have individuals being productive. And so when you hear people conflate the work on the First Step Back to some of the rise in violent crime, there's no real evidence that points directly to that legislation. However, there's a lot of things that happened in our country after the draft in the First Step Back. One, we went into a pandemic for 2 years, and right now we're going to try to figure out as a country that what these lockdowns did around trauma and mental health for many communities. There was an uptick of domestic violence in some of these households, an uptick of abuse towards children, and a number of different things that have affected our communities. And so now more than ever, we need to work together to figure out how do we move forward and how do we deal with the affected. There also was another movement that happened in the summer of 2020 due to the death of George Floyd that encouraged a lot of very left activists to run a campaign on defunding the police. Police had already had a hard enough time doing their job, which is why we got them to support the First Step Back so they can focus on violent criminals all around the country. But they also had issues around recruiting, issues around getting best in class and then professionalizing the police force so they can deal with the challenges of the 21st century. Issues around mental health, issues around homelessness, issues around addiction. I've talked to many attorney generals, and they've talked about that, unlike in the early 90s and late 80s, where most of these crimes were drug related, many of the individuals that they see committing crimes is trauma related. So you can only imagine people who are prone to do crime when they're hearing that the police are going to be defunded, or that some mayors are passing policies where the police can't even pursue someone who they know willingly committed a crime. You're going to encourage more people to want to participate in crime. Yeah. And that's exactly what we're against. Right on Crime has been focused on smart on crime policies that protects public safety, but at the same time makes us safer and makes the country a fairer justice system. And
John, I want to talk a little bit more about the First Step Act, and then I want to talk more about what may be contributing right now. But sure. So, I described that as one of the signature accomplishments of the Trump administration, and you were in the Trump administration, but my recollection is that came very close to not happening. My recollection is that literally it was almost a pleasant surprise. That we actually got over the finish line and the president actually decided to sign it and all of that. There were a lot of folks on the right who were opposed to the First Step Act. And, sure. To me, it's sort of the old conservative attitude toward criminal justice, I think, was lock up as many people for as long as possible. And, even if it turns out that they were wrongly imprisoned or something, they were probably guilty of something else anyway. It was a very harsh, callous attitude, I think, toward criminal justice. And, we've been very pleased to see that starting to change, particularly on the center right of the political spectrum. But I know that there were some Republican senators who were strongly opposed to it, and it was a very near thing, wasn't it? How close did we come to not getting that done?
We came really close to not getting it done. I think that without the leadership of President Trump, we wouldn't have gotten it done. I think that a number of different things happened at the end. I want to say in 2018, that summer, we had a roundtable at Bedminster with a number of governors, including Nathan Deal, Governor Nathan Deal, also Governor Phil Bryant, as well as people who represented some of the reform efforts that happened in Texas. And the president was able to kind of learn directly from individuals like Governor Bryant, who was a former sheriff, and talking about how there's proper measures to do criminal justice reform that actually reduce crime. And so that education really got the president to support that. And so we were able to take that energy back to Washington. But Senator McConnell didn't think it was good timing to work on the legislation. And so he did what happens a lot. He said, let's try to tackle this in the lame duck. And many Congresses, that's usually where legislation goes to die. However, when we got back and I want to say September or October of that year, after doing the August recess, we got to work on it. And we went office to office throughout the Republican conference and really negotiated with every senator, including senators like Tom Cotton. And we were able to kind of close that gap of members who didn't support the legislation because they brought in common sense reform. I mentioned Senator Cruz, who brought in an exclusion for certain individuals who had gun crimes, something that law enforcement really supported. And once we were able to get that amendment, that brought on a whole swath of conservatives that would support the legislation.
Jaron, let me add, there were really some interesting moments along the way. Just great moves. It was a chess match. Day in, day out, there were things. I recall how adamantly opposed Jeff Sessions was to making, to passing the First Step Act or to pass certain provisions of it. And, what did President Trump do? He brought in, at the time, AG Sessions and had a public event in the White House and looked at AG Sessions, who was there, and said, and Jeff's going to help me pass this First Step Act, aren't you? And he was looking at the president, and everyone was looking at him, and so there were moments where you could see that the and it was surprising to me because I had worked on criminal justice reform, trying to get President Obama and the Obama administration to pass changes, and they would not engage. And it was a different Congress, you know, in fairness, it was a different Congress as well. But once Trump engaged, that started to, you know, a lot of dominoes started to fall when he would engage personally on this, and even had to outmaneuver, you know, McConnell on this.
Yeah.
And he did.
He tweeted McConnell. He tweeted McConnell. I remember that. Like,
that's right.
Because McConnell said that, look, we're going to put it on a lame duck. So he brought that back up, you know, towards the end of the year, like, give us a vote on this. And that literally allowed for us to kind of get time on the floor during lame duck, which, like I said before, it never happens.
Very difficult to do. I do think, Tom, that, you know, folks ought to realize when I said that First Step Act is modest, you know, a couple of things about it real quick. In essence, there's just two parts. One part is to incentivize those that are incarcerated to participate in more programming, more education and programming, work programming. And if they'll do that, then they would have the opportunity to earn credits so that they could go into home confinement or a halfway house sooner than they had previously. A lot of people don't realize there's no parole in the federal system. So there's no incentive.
Brett, since you just mentioned that, we should probably remind folks on the Zoom who are not criminal justice experts that the state justice systems are completely separate from the federal justice system.
That's right.
And you know, a lot of times I think people forget that. And First Step, because it's federal legislation, was of course limited to the federal justice system.
That's right. And the system is really, you know, it's very small in comparison to the state criminal justice systems throughout this country. It really only affects, you know, less than 175,000 inmates across this country. That's roughly the size of the inmate population of Texas. So that's a great point, Tom. But the second part of the First Step Act was really to fix certain aspects of the federal code that were being implemented improperly, and so that's why it was fairly modest. But when you know, you have Senator Tom Cotton stand up in Congress and say that the rising crime is a result of First Step Act, it's just a blatant lie. Mm-hmm. It's just a manipulation of the moment, and it's taking politics and at the worst moment using politics as a sword to try to dismantle a policy that you are not honestly evaluating. I saw in the questions a few people have asked, you know, questions about what about data and what about research and you know, how is it reliable? Well, the states are the most reliable test case for reform in this country. We have 50 states who all have the primary responsibility of enforcing criminal law in this country, not the feds, not the federal system. And every state is doing something well and doing some things poorly. And we can learn from that, and we can start to apply those best practices built on data and research. And that's what we're trying to do, is to say, look, that's why you're seeing governors, conservative governors and lawmakers across the country that get it, because they're the ones that have to see the criminal justice system financially and socially and morally. They have to see that day in and day out. So they still want to engage in it, despite this rhetoric that there's a rising crime and that we've got to be tough on crime. The reality is the only way to be tough on crime is to lower the crime rate. Yeah. It's not to be punishing one particular crime longer than you have historically.
There's kind of a logic problem to blaming the First Step Act for the increase in crime, since again, the federal system is so small, right? I mean, it's you know, by and large, it is the state justice systems that deal with most crimes. And so because the First Step Act is limited to the federal level, there's a logic problem to blaming like an increase in, you know, shoplifting or something like that on the First Step Act.
That's right. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you also have on lower level criminals, So the argument is the same, that so you do have individuals who have a non-violent crime, and they just might have had, like, let's say, a couple of bags of marijuana on them, and they got caught up in the system and doing more time than what they should do. And that's what we're trying to address, is that what Smart on Crime policies is saying, that, like, okay, there's clearly a difference between this person and then a person who is kind of with a gun and violently attack someone. Those are two different types of criminals. And what we're saying is that a smarter justice system recognizes that these are two different types of criminals, and that don't get me wrong, you should definitely serve or do time for whatever crime you did. However, we don't want to lock people up and throw away the key. There's a smarter way to address, justice with these individuals. And it's a way that also helps families and communities, because keep in mind, when some of these people are locked up for life, a mother or a father, you're taking them away from their children. And as a result, those children grow up without a parent, or a parent that's incarcerated. And then the statistics also skew that if a parent's incarcerated, the likelihood of the child going to prison also becomes a higher likelihood. And so, as we're trying to create safer communities, we need to focus on a system that's going to be smart enough to recognize when someone has really did a crime, and they should be separated from the population that may be violent, an individual that made a mistake, and that can be corrected with education or vocational training or drug rehab. And so that's the argument that led us to the reform around First Step Act. But again, that came from the states. We got good data from places like Texas and Georgia. There's some other states that did criminal justice the wrong way. Blanket release in Louisiana led to an uptick of crime. And so we kind of learned from that situation. We also learned from how Alaska did some of their reform. And honestly, that played out in Congress. So some of those members from those states saw the way that they went with criminal justice reform and didn't really want to touch it, because they went the wrong direction in it. And
let's look at that, because I'm glad you brought the direction up. But people ask me all the time, what's the difference between the far left policies and what you guys are, why are you different? You're still, you're going to result in soft on crime policies, and there's very distinct differences. You take New York, for example, or you take Harris County in Texas, where they decided they wanted to approach bail reform, but their idea on bail reform was blanket release, like Duran has referenced. And that was not utilizing a system that is proven to work to both protect the community and at the same time try to avoid this problem they're getting at, which is massive incarceration pre-trial, where individuals can't afford bail regardless of what their propensity for violence or risk to the community may be. Well, it's not rocket science. There are areas across this country where they've said, okay, what we're going to do is we are going to eliminate some of that low-level bail on real low-level offenses where we don't have risk of violence and we don't have any factors. But at the same time, we're going to increase the judge's ability to assess the risk of danger to the community and to be able to hold that individual pre-trial if there are risks of danger. This is the exact problem of the Waukesha parade, nightmare that we saw. An individual that is not held in custody, who had an outstanding warrant for violence, had a high risk of violence to the community, and was allowed out based on really poor policy decisions. So that's one example of a difference to where conservatives can come in and say, hey, guess what? It's working over here in Utah. They're doing this. They're doing A, B, C, and D with pretrial release and bail reform. So let's not go based on emotion. Let's not go far left on this particular policy, because we can see it doesn't work. And that's why I think conservatives and that are important. and it really is perhaps the last bipartisan issue in this country is changing and fixing broken parts of the criminal justice system.
Yeah, Brett, I appreciate that distinction. I may have been overly crude when I framed it as good criminal justice reform versus bad criminal justice reform. But,
no, I think that's fine.
Bail reform is a great example of that, because, just your average person hears bail reform, right? And they see the disaster that has happened in New York with bail reform. And so they think all bail reform must be inherently a bad idea. But, like everything else, the devil's in the detail, right? I mean, there is such a thing as a good, responsible bail reform that is actually constructive and moves us in the right direction. And then there's really stupid bail reform that, like you said, just basically you commit a crime and you get immediately released back out into the community.
Right. That's right. It's interesting that one of the few areas of the federal system where they actually do it the right way is on this pretrial release question. In essence, everyone gets a hearing, and a lot of this is impracticable with the caseloads that we have. So there still has to be some overhaul in the state system. But if you could apply the federal system, in essence, you go before a judge, and the prosecutor gets to present any evidence that you're a risk of danger to the community. And the defense attorney gets to try to rebut that. And the judge makes a decision based on that evidence. It's not about bail. It's not about the amount of money they can afford. And it's not about trying to speculate on how high to set that bail in order to prevent them from being able to post it so that they'll stay in. Instead, it's an honest assessment of what is the risk of this individual in the community. And so in the federal system, you have very few pretrial crimes that occur because of that change. It's not perfect, but it's a far better system. And that's an example of how we could implement that in more places. We would have better outcomes.
We like to use the shorthand, we should incarcerate people we're afraid of, not people that we're mad at. And it just seems like, if we wove that principle through a lot of these things, if we wove it through, pretrial release and bail reform and all of that, of course, if somebody is accused of committing a violent crime, we don't want to just turn them right back out on the street. But so many of these first-time offenders and low-level crimes, it's like, when you incarcerate them unnecessarily, that's where the dominoes all start to tip, right?
Right.
That's the point where now they can't work. They can't work their job. Their license gets suspended. They can't drive to work. They can't pay the bail, so they're stuck there. And it's you can get crossways with the justice system on a fairly small offense, and if you're not careful, all those dominoes start tipping, and all of a sudden now that's your life.
Tom, that's a great point. I will tell you that, just like a really bad golfer who may not understand the game, and they stand up there and they think they understand how to fix that slice or how to fix a bad shot, but they don't have the basis. That's what we've been doing as a society. Almost every instinct in some areas of this country, and with some politicians, every instinct they have about the criminal justice system is wrong. Mm-hmm. And you take it's sometimes the simplest things, but you saw that there was this effort that we're going to punish individuals in the prison system by not letting them have very much communication with their family. This will be a further way that we punish them. Well, it was a really bad policy and a really bad instinct, and it's being implemented across this country without understanding that the more you allowed communication with family, the lower the recidivism rate would be in individuals incarcerated. So our instinct was wrong because it was being driven by bad policy. And if we can educate folks and show them, guess what? We can incarcerate these individuals, and we can do things that can help them lower their recidivism while they're incarcerated. Because as John said, 95% of individuals incarcerated in this country will get out. And what shape do we want them in? if we can make some adjustments to the criminal justice system so that we give them better opportunities when they get out to reduce their recidivism, then we've been tough on crime. We have lowered the crime rates in those areas.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's tough.
That's why
It's tough on crime rather than just tough on people.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's why reentry is so important, because 1 in 3 of Americans have a criminal record, me included, but the second chances I got, I went directly to my church and I got an opportunity to advise and help people who were homecomers, people who were coming home from prisons, giving them soft skills, helping them get a job, and then look, I was able to advise a president after that. If I had not had a second chance, then who knows how my life would have ended up, and this happens to a lot of different Americans, whether you're talking urban or rural. Everyone has like a family member who has a criminal record or has a past. And the thing is just giving people as like a Christian virtue, an opportunity to, learn from their mistakes and become a better individual. And we know the difference between the two. And our justice system should recognize that. And so that's at the heart of smart on crime policies.
I want to mention one more observation, and then I'd like us to go and talk specifically about the increase in crime and what we think some of the causes for that are. But, Brett and Jerron, as conservatives, it's always struck me that it's a little odd that we're skeptical of government power in every area except justice. And somehow in the justice area, we just automatically think that the government has it right and does it right all the time. If you think about the incentives involved, the incentive for a prosecutor is to put people away, right? I remember I had a friend who was a defense attorney one time tell me that, Tom, if you ever are so unfortunate as to get crossways with the justice system, there are entire office buildings full of people who are being paid by the taxpayers to put you away. And you're fortunate if you have one good defense attorney, but I mean, it just strikes me that it's always been a little bit idiosyncratic for conservatives to just place blind faith in government when it comes to the justice system and criminal prosecution.
I tell people all the time that conservatives care so much about holding their government accountable and shrinking the government, except for the criminal justice system. Yeah, we've let it run free reign without any accountability. And I include prosecutors on this. A lot of people don't realize the actual inability that we presently have across this country to hold prosecutors accountable. They wield so much power, they have so much authority, and we have continued to sort of shield that authority from scrutiny, from accountability, that it is ripe for abuse. Mm-hmm. And I've written on this. I've written on the fact that there is prosecutorial abuse in this country, that conservatives, they got real upset when it was discovered in the Ted Stevens prosecution, right, that there was abuse by the prosecutors. But it's not isolated, and it doesn't care about which political side of the aisle you're on. A prosecutor isn't day in and day out prosecutors. There's many well-meaning, good prosecutors that are exercising discretion properly. But there are plenty that have, succumbed to this win at all costs mentality, that if we don't do something to make sure that they know that they are being scrutinized and they will be held accountable, then I fear we will have given too much power to one branch of the government. And it's conservatives, I think, that need to step up in that regard and start to hold these offices accountable.
Yeah, and qualified immunity is part of the problem there. And we could do a whole briefing on qualified immunity. Let's go on and talk about the increase in crime. Is it fair to say that it's mostly happening in blue states, or are we seeing it in red states as well?
You want to go first, John? Or
yeah, I was going to say it's a fair assessment, especially in major metropolitans. which is kind of driving the crime wave. Again, I mentioned earlier about this movement to defund the police has had, to me, very negative consequences because many metropolitan mayors enacted policies that inhibited the police ability to do their job. And so I certainly think that has contributed to it. Everything, like I could tell you, I live in Washington, D.C., a person could commit a crime right in front of a police officer and the police officer won't go pursue them, because they put some laws in place that don't want them police officers pursuing people.
Yeah, we hear lots of stories about just broad daylight carjackings and things like that happening in DC.
Oh yeah, it's tough. I mean, literally, me and my wife moved out of DC just in October, just because of the rise in crime in our neighborhood. And mostly it's because you're not really allowing the police officers to be able to do their job. Look, there's definitely a needle to be thread between fairness and also having community safety. And, most Black communities, I'll just go out there and say it straight, want public safety in their communities. They want police to be there to show up. And there's a lot of statistics and evidence. And honestly, when those statistics started to come out, Texas Southern put out the data on that information. You saw the left move away from that narrative slowly, but it didn't catch up quick enough because a lot of mayors are continuing to kind of enact these policies that aren't protecting public safity.
And let me add to that, Tom, because I think it's important. This policing issue is complex, and while the message defund the police, it's nuanced, and it is a message that has scared some communities, obviously, and it is the wrong message if you're trying to emphasize public safety. If you send messages like that, then there are repercussions for it. But that doesn't mean that there isn't need in this country to also, fix aspects of policing, just like they're a part of the criminal justice system, and there is reform that is needed. Absolutely. And so, the needle has to be thread, but it can be done. What you can't do is send a message, for example, we will not prosecute any of these crimes. Well, guess what will happen over the next few, weeks and months? Those crimes are going to be what you're seeing. And we see that repeating itself in these communities. But at the same time, you cannot have a police force that doesn't have proper accountability, because that will do exactly what happens when you don't hold any other aspect of the government accountable. Yeah. They will grow and consume power, and then they will abuse and mistreat those. Not everyone, I'm not saying that, but that is the formula, and why conservatives need to step up and be willing also to take a look at policies. One of the biggest issues facing policing right now is the mental health issue in this country. And resources need to be going to fixing the mental health problem in this country. And let's face it, police officers are not who you want trying to fix the mental health problems in this country.
Yeah, I totally agree with Brett. I want to say this part right here, because you mentioned earlier about conservatives having faith in the justice system. I can say, because I told you this earlier, before I was a conservative, I was an African-American male living in Cleveland, Ohio. And the justice system was the one thing I did not trust the government. It actually, in essence, led me to being a conservative, having a more limited government. However, that doesn't mean that we don't need public safety. And so the way I see it, law enforcement officers, I was blessed, and at that same time in my life, to have a cousin who was a law enforcement officer, who's an older cousin that I looked up to. And he became a good friend and a good mentor, and he's still really close to me today. And so, not all police are bad policemen, and I got to learn that from knowing this cousin specifically, and then going on to work on the Hill and developing very close relationships with our Capitol Police and some of the law enforcement in that area. What I didn't really realize is that, I used to always wonder why it wasn't enough police officers that were from our community, or police officers that look like me in our community, that kind of there lies the question, is that there's a relationship aspect that's missing, and so aspects around community policing are extremely important. I end up working with a lot of nonviolent groups through Bob Woodson that worked on crime by having a partnership with police and former gang members who basically would go into a community, squash beef, or get ahead of crime before it happens. That's all to say that, like, for the 21st century, we need to just rethink policing. Just like in the 60s, we had the Johnson Commission. We need to apply some new best practices that can help police do their job. And so much of the time I spent in the Trump administration the last 2 years was doing those two things. I mean, policemen have to deal with a lot of issues, such as mental health issues. You can imagine all the trauma that police officers come across that may have trauma and issues with them in themselves. There's high suicide rates in police officers. Pay to kind of do police officer work in the places that need it most is hard to quantify. So there's a lot of different things. And Brett mentioned the mental health piece, co-responder services. Maybe there's opportunities to maybe have police officers show up with social workers who are in a better place to deal with individual mental health, or have drug abuse, or a homeless person. These are all things that police agree with and community advocates agree with. But what we're trying to do is create the right incentives to get these police departments to modernize. If you look at a lot of the police officers, police departments that have had issues in the past, some of them haven't, had standards around use of force and the proper training to do their jobs because of lack of resources. So we need quite the opposite with a lot of our police departments, and it's investing in them and investing in the ecosystem that can do both things by encouraging people in the community, as well as encouraging the police department to be a part of the community. And so there's just a wide open lane for us to work on.
Hey, Tom, there's one question that I kind of want to address that is, an issue currently, and that is what about these progressive prosecutors and some of the outrageous decisions that are being made? How do you hold them accountable, and should they be held accountable?
Well, we should first point out, I think, that when you hear prosecutors essentially saying we're not going to prosecute people anymore for shoplifting of under certain dollar amounts or whatever, that is the bad kind of criminal justice reform, right?
That's right.
We've already talked about the fact that we don't want low-level offenses to put people on a career path toward becoming hardened criminals. On the other hand, if you just announce that everybody gets a free pass on shoplifting, that's also a disaster. And I think those are the stories that make the news. Those are the stories that people who don't pay attention to criminal justice, nonetheless, they see that and they say that's crazy. And of course, one of our great concerns is that the good kind of criminal justice reform effort doesn't become discredited because of stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And I firmly believe and have advocated that a prosecutor that refuses to enforce the law is a prosecutor that should not be in office. They're not the ones that get to decide. Now there's resource issues, I get that, but these blanket sort of announcements that they will no longer prosecute a certain, it's the legislature that passes the laws, and those laws do need to be enforced, or those laws need to be changed. But
and prosecutors always have discretion. Prosecutors always have discretion, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that discretion is to be exercised on an individual basis,
right?
And injustice is supposed to be individualized. And remember that the hallmark of fairness in the justice system is consistency, right? And so you can't pick and choose winners and losers based on substituting your position on a law as a prosecutor. Many people are going to grapple with this. A lot of states are. Texas is looking at it. What do you do in a situation? And you're going to see some changes, whether that will mean that the attorney general of the state will be granted jurisdiction over areas that prosecutors refuse to bring, or whether something else, some other system. But it is dangerous. It is a problem, and those prosecutors are not helping the criminal justice reform movement. Now, having said that, there are progressive prosecutors that are implementing some really good policies and some really good reforms. You think about the prosecutor, and conservatives are doing this. They're standing up conviction integrity units, for example, that are reviewing actual claims of innocence. That's a good thing, because we do get things wrong, and so there are changes that can come as a result of good policies, but we have to be very, very careful of the bad ones.
I want to get to as many questions as possible. And so I'm going to ask both you and Jerron to try to keep your answers as short and concise as you can, just so we can make the most of, and I'm not accusing you of anything, but we want to try to make the most of our remaining time. And I think Jerron made an interesting point. I was trying to frame this as red state versus blue state, but it really seems to be metropolitan areas, right? And metropolitan areas very often tend to be governed by, Democrats or people of the blue persuasion, maybe we would say. And it's not a conservative conspiracy. This idea that there was an organized effort to get progressive prosecutors and progressive district attorneys elected, that's not a conservative conspiracy theory, right? I mean, that actually happened, right, Brett?
Yes, I mean, that's right. It does, and that's not a conspiracy.
Now, cities and counties, municipalities only have as much power as the state legislature allows them to have. So is it possible that there are ways state legislatures could get involved that would, you're talking about holding them accountable, but are there things that the state legislature can do that will prevent them from misbehaving in the first place?
It's very difficult. Oftentimes your bar, your local state bars have limited ability to hold, prosecutors, for example, accountable. The legislature does have to take a closer look at the power that's been given to prosecutors. Now, I have advocated before that there are levels of misconduct, for example, and if a prosecutor, what they do amounts to a crime, they should be susceptible to prosecution. If it's a mistake, then that's very different. So it all comes down to the same sort of analysis that is used when we look at criminal intent. But purposeful abuse of the system can be a substantial problem, and there needs to be ways to hold them accountable. And some of that may be through your state bar. Some of that may be through private actions that can be brought, but those are very difficult with existing immunity laws.
We have several questions that are all sort of related to data reporting, and I'm going to just try to summarize them. One of the concerns is that some of these sort of progressive prosecutors and progressive DAs are simply not even reporting the data accurately as far as like number of arrests and things like that. And there's been some tension and some frustration between law enforcement and the local DA and the local prosecutors that, we've heard sheriffs say anecdotally that the increase in crime is even greater than the statistics show, because the statistics are skewed because not everything's even being reported, again, purposely by some of these progressive criminal justice folks. Is there anything to that?
Well,
yeah.
I'll first say
Go ahead,
data. I would just say that like data, period, on criminal justice stats is like all over the place. When we were working on the First Step Act, it was hard finding data around what works. We knew we had two states that were doing really well, and we had some scenarios which gave us some guidance on what we think would work. But if you get into like the weeds of data analytics, we're in the 21st century just really learning how to collect a lot of that stuff, and a lot of the systems that are in place are very old and antiquated. I'm not, Brett can kind of speak more to the conspiracy, but that's been my experience almost across the board with dealing with underserved communities, that the data analytics and how we collect that data is really skewed. It's not modernized. In many cases, they still do stuff by paper on old computers and stuff like that. So you never know what drops off. But go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, no, that's well said. Both sides, though, manipulate data. Both sides of the issue manipulate data. Those that want to show that, you know, the crime rate is higher than it is, they in order to push a political purpose, there's that manipulation. There's manipulation on the other side to show it's not as bad and these policies are working. The reality is people feel they feel unsafe in a lot of areas, right? You don't have to be a rocket scientist and have great data to understand that the subway system right now in New York is, you know, the citizens are really afraid and they're upset, and there's a rise in crime, whether it's 30, whether it's 60%. It's a large rise in crime from historical places. So we know something needs to be done in order to lower that, you know, that crime rate in that particular area. What I think you should focus on is securing third parties, you know, reliable third parties to come in and to actually mine data and to generate reports, and then to look at it and have opportunity for both sides to criticize it and vet that data, and also add to it best practices from around the country that are trying to solve some of the same problems. When you start to do that, you do start to achieve better policy implementation.
We have another question about the First Step Act. You mentioned, I think it was Jaron who mentioned that there were statistics that the First Step Act improved recidivism at the federal level. But we have a question about, are there people who were released as a result of the First Step Act who then went on to reoffend? And so I want to ask that question, but I also want to point out that, you know, the idea here is to change trends, but nothing's ever going to be 100% right. You know, I mean, whatever direction you err in, you're not going to get it exactly right. But do we know anything about people who became repeated offenders who were helped by the First Step Act?
Yes, there are some individuals, because you got to understand too, some individuals, we gave more flexibility to some judges. So some judges were a little more lenient than others. So if you had like a conservative judge, you probably would be less likely to kind of give a person a second chance. You have a more liberal judges, you might have let someone out that probably didn't deserve it. But I think your point is that overall, we're able to kind of drastically reduce recidivism rates. And that was the goal. And it hasn't been perfect. But if you look at that delta of individuals that if we kept things the same, wouldn't have reoffended, would have reoffended, but now haven't because of the First Step Act. That's the goal that we're trying to go towards. And so so drastically, most people haven't recidivated, but there have been some individual cases and where some people have returned to prison.
Yeah, I think keep in mind that legislation often comes as a result of anecdotes, right? So one story occurs, an individual goes out and commits a horrific crime. It's bad. It's something you hope to avoid, but then legislators on both sides will utilize it as an effort to try to change, you know, the criminal justice system in their favor, you know, the way they want to. That can be a real problem. But the reality is recidivism rates have gone down because of efforts in the First Step Act, and more can be done where we don't compromise public safety. We actually increase public safety.
You know, you had mentioned, I think Jaron mentioned, you know, defunding the police. I mean, the other thing we did is we demonized the police. And, you know,
Yeah.
While all that was going on, I think a lot of us were thinking, who in their right mind would want to, you know, sign up for law enforcement sort of in this environment that's been created. So I think that's also an important point. We had a question about DC's pretrial release program. A lot of the horror stories that we hear on the increase in crime are coming from DC.
Yeah, Brett, you can go speak specific on that.
Oh, go ahead, Drew.
No, I mean, to follow Brett's comments earlier, you know, it's gotten really bad in areas, and the newly developed areas of the city that have historically been safe for at least last decade because of some of the policies that have been put in place. And the challenge is that even in this upcoming election, the current mayor is probably the most conservative versus all the people that are running against her. And the same thing with the attorney general. But I certainly see, just like Brett mentioned before, I'm less likely to kind of be in certain areas of the town that were safer, pre-pandemic than now. I wouldn't be out at night with my kids or anything like that. I've even heard of a person on Capitol Hill whose daughter, a man and his daughter were attacked with a rock. A guy threw a rock at a 11-month-old girl. And so we're dealing with a lot here in the city. I can't speak to the specific policy that you just mentioned, but I can certainly feel it and see it all around the city.
Do we think that the election of Eric Adams in New York City had something to do with the people pushing back against some of these too tolerant attitudes toward crime?
Yeah, I think it was a watershed moment for sure on the left, because you had the most activist individuals running for mayor on the defund police agenda, and you have a former police officer that ran and won overwhelmingly. Because the people, it's like Brett said earlier, people see what's going on in these communities and they want public safety. They also want a fairer justice system. And it's a way that thread a needle by having smarter on crime policies that do both. But certainly there was a big movement there in New York to kind of do policies that put communities more at risk.
And I wanted to also, let's see, we've got another question here about New York. We keep hearing about people being pushed onto this in front of subway trains and things like that. And Brett, you mentioned the mental health, or it may have been John who mentioned the mental health issue. In the wake of the terrible tragedy that just happened yesterday here in Texas in Uvalde, I can't help but think that one of the biggest crises we have in this country right now is a mental health crisis, and it's contributing toward homelessness. It's contributing toward addiction, and it contributes toward the rise in crime, especially petty crime. And, as one of you mentioned, police officers are not mental health counselors. So is part of the solution to this getting actually more serious about being more active and proactive on mental health?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I think there are a number of factors that we have, we've not had honest discussions about mental health in the country. You look at the addiction issues; those are enormous. But we also, as a country, we are using prescription medication on children that have horrific side effects to try to address it. And let's face it, you have a pharmaceutical industry that is, lobbying Congress so that they avoid accountability. You have many factors. You have shutdowns that have occurred, and you have. So I'm not an expert on it. I don't have all of the answers, but I do know that we have not honestly had a discussion about all the contributing factors in this country to these tragedies. And one thing that we have done is we've tried to suggest that the police are the ones that are going to solve this through their actions. And that is not the case. They are not the ones that are equipped to respond to mental health issues. Uvalde is a perfect example. We're now getting a picture of this 18-year-old, where he was at mentally, what his home life was like, the warning signs that were there. And we don't know yet what was being done to address the underlying problems and issues, and it's happening across this country.
Yeah, I think that's a really big issue that we need to deal with as a country. And like Brett, I'm not an expert on these issues, but just infrastructure around mental health needs to be reevaluated. The cost of even going to therapy is extremely high for a lot of communities, and just create a new ecosystem where we can help those that need to get help. When I lived in the city, I lived next door to two young men who had mental health issues, and my worst fear was what would happen with them and their parents, because their parents, who were aged in their 70s, couldn't manage the two of them, and at least twice a week, or sometimes 3 times a week, the police would come out to deal with them going overboard. So it's a real challenge, and police officers ask for that. I mean, I think that when I worked on the executive order that President Trump signed on 21st century policing, we really brought both sides together, advocacy groups. You got individuals like Lee Merritt that worked with individuals who were the head of the FOP, and we all came together on this mental health piece. So you had families who lost loved ones with police interactions, as well as police departments, both saying that, like, look, let's both work on mental health. That's the area where we agree. But there's not enough resource out of HHS to really deal with that issue. And so we got to really think strategically, because even if you're talking about our workforce issues, people keeping a job, the mental health and the drug abuse barrier, keeps people from staying employed. And we know that's one thing that kind of deters people from doing crime.
It sure seems to me that the costs to society of an upfront mental health intervention has got to be cheaper than the ongoing costs to society of someone, who is dangerous, violent, a threat to themselves and others. They're also going to be interacting regularly with the healthcare system and things like that. So, I'm very interested in some of the stuff that Michael Schellenberger's talking about in California, where he's trying to recast the whole homelessness problem as a mental health problem, right? It's a problem of mental health and addiction. And those are the root causes. And if you could work on those, you would solve all of those other problems, or at least many of those other problems. We have a question here, and it's kind of related. What is the role of nonprofit and ministry organizations in criminal justice reform? I assume this is related to not just prevention before people go in, but then also restitution and sort of redemption after they come out. And are there things government does that makes it harder for ministries and nonprofits to actually play a role there?
Yeah, great comments. Look, the criminal justice system has some systemic problems. The system itself has to have some areas that are major overhaul areas. And if your focus isn't, I'll give you an example. In the Department of Justice, there's a 3-part purpose. It's to deter crime, it's to punish those that commit crime, and it's rehabilitation. But for decades, there's been no effort on rehabilitation side. And there's been a bit of a black box mentality where we're not going to let outsiders in. We're not going to let organizations see what we're doing. And you have a complex that has grown up without a lot of accountability. Well, part of the transparency that could come is partnering with groups that can be involved at the front end. Ministries and work and education groups that can be involved during the incarceration phase. And then on the reentry side, think about what good can come from, companies across this country that work with individuals coming out of prison to make them, part of the workforce, for example. So there is a vast need across this country to utilize organizations. And I think it will provide this added benefit of more transparency and more accountability of our criminal justice system.
Sure. Now, let me add to that a little bit, because, when I worked in the White House, this strategy around safe communities, I don't want to kind of just concentrate of the work being in this vacuum that's just on public safety. These things all kind of run hand in glove. A good education system, access to capital to start a business, issues around having a job and having job availability, and being able to have the skills for those jobs. All of those things can contribute to safe communities. But of course, sometimes you don't get those things if a community is unsafe because you get lack of investment. And so it's a holistic issue that kind of deal with a lot of these low-income areas around the country. And those low-income areas can be urban or rural. If you don't have kind of some of these core institutions, you're going to have people who are going to get left behind. And if they're not doing things productive like going to work every day, or being in a position to kind of feed their family, they're more susceptible to kind of living a life in crime. And so I think that these institutions like churches and nonprofits play a critical role, especially if we're dealing with individuals who have third or second or fourth generation of trauma in their family, and they're trying to get on the ladder of opportunity, but they have issues that they haven't really been able to get over mentally, or something happens and they get caught up in the criminal justice system and they can't rebound from it. And they're not resilient enough to kind of rebound because of the mental pressures of thinking they're not good enough, or that they are the mistake that they made in the past. So it's a very complex issue, but I certainly think that issues of the heart are better dealt with civil society rather than the government. I think that churches and nonprofits that deal with people have a very important element to add to this conversation, because many of those individuals who get into that type of work do it because it's the right thing. And it's not to say that I'm a civil servant, so obviously, I got into serving the country and stuff because I thought it was the right thing. But there's a lot of government people who look at it as just a job. You know what I mean? And so having those institutions stood up, and then just thinking about a nuanced way that we can kind of work with the private sector companies, work with the government, work with civil society, and for us to kind of work together to create these ecosystems of opportunities is at the heart of what we need to do as Americans.
Let's try to wrap up. We got to a number of our questions, but we got a ton of questions and we didn't get to all of them. But let's wrap up by sort of returning to the advertised topic, which is the increase in violent crime. And I think we have, during this discussion, we've attributed it toward a number of factors. I think we've attributed it toward the pandemic and the sort of unknown effects of lockdowns and things like that. We've attributed it toward demonizing the police and tying the hands of police and defunding the police. We've tied it to some very unwise forms of criminal justice reform in metropolitan areas where they've simply decided not to prosecute crime. How do we think this plays out? I mean, is the ultimate solution to this for the people who live in these areas, who live in cities, to just have had enough and vote with their feet and either leave the cities or insist on political change? How does this, I would like to have both of your thoughts on sort of like where things go from here and what can be done.
Yeah, so what I am seeing personally is there's movement where those far left policies, you're starting to see folks start to move back towards the center. When I say folks, you're even seeing in some of the very blue cities, you're seeing calls for change, and you're seeing calls for getting tougher on certain crimes and to prosecute these crimes. And so there will continue to be unrest, and people living in these communities, they want to feel safe. The risk, however, is it's typically in those moments that we need the most data and research and best practices across the country to implement very good policies and not just do something that is going to, do more harm. And it's something that we hope we can reach out and start to work with some of these folks in these cities. We will be a resource at Right on Crime to try to help advise them, to show them what other cities have done, to work with them, regardless of whether they're, blue, purple, or red. We all are Americans and we all want safe communities. And I think we can do that. And so I'm hopeful that
public safety should be nonpartisan, shouldn't it?
Right. It should.
Very much so. Very much so. No, just to add to what Brett said, that's the work that we're doing, trying to advocate with bringing both sides together with practical solutions that make communities safer, but also allowing for a more just criminal justice system. I would say that, aside from my work as a fellow at Right on Crime, I want to work on all the other things, like access to capital for people who want to start a business. So many people that I grew up around, they want to be business people and then they end up doing the wrong business,
Right.
and we want to kind of leverage that entrepreneurial spirit in the right direction. And then it's creating jobs. It's giving people skills around financial literacy, and learning how to be a father or be a mother, all of the things that we take for granted in civil society. All that needs to be, to me, focused on. We know the communities that need it most. It's just us being very intentional about working together to create solutions. And I'm sure that, and I'm an optimistic person, that the best is still ahead of us, and it is still plenty of time for us to work together and solve some of these issues.
Thank you, Jerron, and thank you, Brett. We really appreciate this. I think this has been an excellent discussion. I want to apologize for the confusion over poor Zach McHugh. Zach, whoever you are, if you'll hit me up sometime, I'll buy you a drink just to apologize for cloning you 30 times on our Zoom. We really appreciate just Brett and Jerron. I want you to know that we appreciate sort of being in this fight with you for criminal justice reform that is more just, frankly, that's just more just for everyone. And this idea that public safety, there's no reason why public safety should be a red or blue issue. There's no reason why that should be a baseline issue, right? I mean,
that's right.
Why would anyone not want that, And, once you sort of establish that as a baseline, we ought to be able to find ways to make sure that low-level first-time infractions don't put somebody on a one-way street toward a lifetime of crime.
Right.
And I think both sides recognize that that's been a problem in the past. So hopefully we can continue to work in a bipartisan way on these issues, both at the state level and at the federal levels. And I would encourage our attendees, if you're interested in this topic, and you should be, pay attention to the work of Right on Crime, pay attention to the overall work on criminal justice reform that is happening on the center right. I think it's one of the most impactful and important things that we can be doing in the public policy world these days. So thanks again for joining us. I know the chat has been very active and we got more questions than we could get to, but we really appreciate everyone's engagement. Go to rightoncrime.com, sign up, go to ipi.org, sign up, and we hope that you will all be able to join us for future events like this. So from IPI, I would like to thank Brett and Jerron. I'd like to thank Tanya at Right on Crime, who helped to facilitate all the logistics of this, and Addie at IPI. Thanks to you. And with that, we will let you go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.